Mega Man Issue 36. It starts by blatantly wasting our time recapping the defeat of Raw Moon and Shadow Man being told goodbye. And somehow, Wily tells his minions to not bother trying to go after Shadow Man to recruit him for him again, even though he's in no shape to fight. This would be like Sadie M. Robotnik telling people to not bother trying to retrieve a Robian or roboticize someone. There's a text box that's worthless by doing nothing but stating the obvious, soon. Gutsman gets mad at Wily for using a screwdriver on him and gets told Wily did nothing but bring the original Robot Masters back online because their coding was safeguarded. With this being possible, how will there be any legitimate excuse for Wily successfully taking over the later Robot Masters? Why would Dr. Light not share his anti-tamper coding with the rest of the people who owned Robot Masters? That's insanely forced of him. It means the writer wrote himself into a corner by establishing that, which he had to do because of an original story arc he didn't have to make. Well, I took until now to think of this. Dr. Light as a character spends every hour of the day in the Mega Man world, so he's got no excuse for not thinking to share his tamper-proof coding with the rest of the world. Because there's no reason you'd think Wily would never try to take over a Robot Master again. I have to assume that when he does that, he'll do it by making a computer virus that gets past the tamper-proof coding. You'd think part of having tamper-proof coding would be having an antivirus, but of course the antivirus doesn't work if it doesn't recognize that it's a virus because it's brand new. Why is Bombman saying blowed him up if all of the Robot Masters were programmed to know how to speak English from their activation, which would mean he'd have the correct word in his vocabulary? There's no reason any of them would have less of a good vocabulary. It's cathartic that Wily complains about Gutsman asking pointless questions. Then it cuts to the present day where Wily's on the witness stand being interrogated by what looked like Phoenix Wright at first, until a later panel showed what his hair looked like. At first I wondered how he got away with that. Wily admits to being jealous of Dr. Light for good reason, and lies that he thought if he could solve the mystery of the Landfront Ruins disaster, he could win back some goodwill. So that's a perjury charge. He lies that Raw Moon took control of his mind, and that he'll repay the damages he caused. Meanwhile, I'm just distracted by how similar this lawyer looks to Phoenix Wright. I'm not a fan of his game, so for all I know, he doesn't have the exact same hairstyle as him. But I see it as such out of the corner of my eye every time, and it really only gets away with it because he has brown hair. It's still the same unrealistically spiky hairstyle for a lawyer just because anime. Mega Man gets thanked for his testimony, and Dr. Light says that he found traces of psychotropic chemicals. If that's true, then logically how could it not be capable of warping human minds? Why would you establish this if that's not what it means? You wouldn't have the guts to establish that Wily had drugs there. Wily didn't want Raw Moon to succeed in destroying humanity, so he wasn't brainwashed with psychotropic chemicals, which he would have done if he could. Then there's a bunch of boring dialogue from a judge doing recap about what we just learned. What kid would read all this dialogue? This is a kid's comic, and if you're not making a comic that a kid would read all the dialogue of, you have failed. Go figure, Wily's found innocent and sentenced to 5 years of house arrest under the supervision of Dr. Light if he pays for the damages. Wily thanks Dr. Light and humors him by shaking his hand. Naturally, Dr. Light says that he should take Wily out of the public eye for a while, and then reintroduce him to the world attached to a project wonderful enough to outshine his past. That clearly wouldn't work. People wouldn't think Wily was necessary to complete the project. Clearly Dr. Light regrets not letting him help make the speech about the first Robot Masters, because this flies in the face of his excuse for that. He said that associating Wily with a project of his would undermine what he's trying to do with Light Labs. But now he's flip-flopped on it. I can understand him wanting to get him working on a project for good, but not him trying to get Wily reintroduced to the public as attached to a project of his, when it's obvious people still won't forgive him and Light knew that, or he would have let him make the speech with him. After Roll naturally complains about the idea of Wily living with her, we see Wily giving Dr. Light some advice on how to build a robot, which he's not following, but at least he tells him why he won't follow that. This whole scenario with Wily living with him only makes me wish I could see an alternate universe where he never squanders his second chance with him, and was brainwashed into causing the first 2 games. Wily says they're building a new robot that could let them test out multiple Robot Master systems at once. Naturally, Mega Man's worried about having to fight this thing. And Dr. Light puts his arms around the 2 of them and puts his hand on Roll's back, ushering her out of the room. Of course, it's revealed that Mega Man was right. Why does he think an all-in-one war machine could overwhelm Mega Man when it'd still just be one robot against him, and Mega Man would still have a copy chip? Wouldn't that mean he could simply copy way more data than usual from him? He'd only fight him after he already copied all the data of 3's Robot Masters, and he'd only have the data of those, I guess. So that won't matter. The point is, he already made a robot that could use all of Mega Man's powers, but I guess it makes sense here that he thinks trying it again would work, because in the comic, he never got to see that he could have beaten Copy on his own. In the game, it's about as logical as him sending more Robot Masters after someone who defeats Robot Masters. Or Dr. Light making this robot for no reason. Then Dr. Light puts his hand on his shoulder and uses an elevator to show him a giant machine meant to handle any global crisis. It wouldn't need to be big, so I'm waiting for a proper explanation. He already has Mega Man and the other Robot Masters to be peacekeeping robots. They can handle a global crisis without being giant. Wily naturally asks how he had time to build this force unnecessary machine. Dr. Light says he's had robots building the basic structures. Dr. Light explains to Wily that if he turned him away, it would be his fault if he lashed out again. He apologizes for him feeling insulted for the current circumstances, and he humors him by saying he's sorry he's not as gracious as he could be. Flashman freezes Dr. Light in time and says Quickman had to tell him to spare Dr. Light for some reason. Flashman gives him an update he requested, as I wonder why Wily didn't program all of the Robot Masters to know not to kill Dr. Light. He says he got past security because Proto Man's old access codes still work here, because Dr. Light was hoping he'd come back home. That doesn't explain it. He could come by and ring the doorbell without the codes. That doesn't mean he needs to have him still retain access to his lab after he caught him trying to kill Mega Man. So he only got here because of a violation of common sense. Yeah, he has no idea how to write geniuses. You write what you know. This would be like Tails still letting Fiona have access to his lab. He tells Flashman to carry on, and I have to assume he left the room after this. I also have to assume that Wily knew exactly how long Flashman's time stop would last. But still, he wouldn't have been able to concentrate on keeping count of the seconds while he was being talked to. He shakes his hand after he unfreezes, and later at the park, Wily lampshades that he shouldn't mention himself in his speech to people. He says a blatant lie that he's no good at public speaking, and rolled lampshades that he did fine when he was threatening everyone. What he obviously means to say is he's no good at public speaking in a way that makes him sound nice. So of course he did fine back then. What is the point of Flynn forcing Wily to think that the past few weeks working with Dr. Light have felt good and fun, and considering not going through with the plan, when he's always going to be written like an unrealistic cartoon villain, and usually is? It's not like he's ever hugged Proto Man. So this is an ass pull, especially for a character called Dr. Wily. The resolution of the Robo-Enza virus is the only time in the Mega Man series when Wily ever showed a conscience. And that was one outlier so far after the original games that it's obvious it was written by people who either didn't write the originals or didn't care about keeping Wily in character after so long because they wanted a convenient ending. While I appreciate this depth, it's also annoying to have a hope spot you don't have to write. And it's weird to cherry pick one example for an excuse to make a character out of character. By that logic, I could say it was in character for Mega Man to go power hungry and violent in the first arc because it's based off him threatening to kill Wily at the end of Mega Man 7. But that was a mistranslation. Dr. Light thanks the audience for showing up to his boring speech, and lampshades that it doesn't feel like a year has passed since the first Robot Masters. Yeah, it feels like just a few weeks. I guess the time skip is justified because you don't go to trial immediately after jail, but 11 months is ridiculous. And Wily lampshades in his thoughts that Dr. Light's lying that he was the only one who built the first Robot Masters. If Dr. Light thinks it wouldn't be a good look to admit that Wily helped design them, even though he wasn't against his ban on robotics because he wasn't personally making them, then why does he have him next to him for a speech? That's not a good look either. Wily's naturally annoyed by his saccharine speech that wastes time praising Mega Man and for no reason whines that a lot has happened to him. Maybe he should have gone over the speech with him first. Wily thinks that all of this would have been avoided if he'd been up here the first time, and now he's only getting partial credit with his genius coming up second to his. And it's completely forced. The same logic for letting him be next to him in his speech also applies to not taking full credit for his work like a plagiarist. And this guy's supposed to be a saint? And why does Wily think all of this would have been avoided if he'd been up here the first time, when he's up here now, and he's still upset? When it should be obvious that even if he had been up here the first time, he still would have only gotten partial credits. Wily plans to betray him because Dr. Light was forced by the writer to lie and give him second billing, and because the Mega Man 3 adaptation is coming up. The fact that the comic's allowed to show later Robot Masters early makes me wonder if it's actually forced to have game adaptations, or if it's just the writer being lazy, because you'd think Capcom would have a deadline. He calls Wily to the mic and he thanks Dr. Light, and the next page is wasted on boring dialogue nobody would ever care about. This is just recap. Dr. Light's terrible at making speeches. Why would he think the audience forgot about the history of robots, which is so intuitive that nobody would need to be told it? He says he wants to make a robot to help people with earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, and volcanoes. We saw a Robot Master save someone from a flood. He should explain that it's a giant robot so that it could fit tons of people on it. So that explains it. Rush gets hit by a flying fist, and Wily still pretends to be on Dr. Light's side by telling him to get down, and Wily's robots head over there on hoverboards planning to take the elements making up Gamma. Eventually Wily tells the robots that Ramoon is dead so they don't have to follow his wishes, and the robots get away. Mega Man talks as if Rush would hurt himself transforming, and Roll asks Wily if he's hurt, and he tries to play for sympathy, which works. I'm just wondering how this went in a game where Ramoon didn't exist. Well, that screws up adapting it. Did Wily just insist that the robots went rogue? That wouldn't have been believable. In the final page, X reassures Kane that his next dig's coming along nicely, and Kane wishes he could find another relic. But the story ends by showing something with Wily's logo on it. Mega Man Issue 37. It starts with someone calling X the demon template and wanting him shot, and that makes me assume that he agrees with the Emerald Spears, which makes all the more sense in the X series. It's lampshaded that the shot missed. X takes the weapon away, and Zero grabs the other sniper. Mega Man thanks Zero, and more nothing happens as X tells Zero not to antagonize someone crazy. I don't know why Zero exaggerated calling people from a mere century ago an ancient cult. Neither word is true. Then Mega Man warps somewhere along with the new Explorer robot, and Pharaoh Man, who's here to look for the hidden entrance for him and Wily. Wily gets asked if there's any defenses they should be looking out for, and says they should all be broken. And Pharaoh Man says Wily's mistaken or senile as the trap gets revealed and disabled. Naturally, Brightman doesn't trust Wily, and Pharaoh Man disables the trap floor. And it's finally explained why Mega Man went to that place. It would have been easier to care about the story if I saw this page first. Wily says that was the only place he could think of that the rogue Robot Masters could be hiding, because they could be programmed to see that place as a fallback position. He thanks Roll for the coffee to avoid getting scolded, and it turns out that what's so special about that lab is that it was too dangerous to disassemble in the future with sentient robots. And Wily gets reminded that he was sanctioned for building weapons of mass destruction. What does that have to do with unethical robotic experiments? I'm pretty sure nukes are not robots. This would only make sense if he made a robot with a nuke. Dr. Light thanks Cossack for lending the aid of Pharaoh Man, and for no reason, Wily asks how Klink is sleeping and lies that he helped destroy Raw Moon in any way. That mug must have already had a damaged handle to have gotten broken by normal human strength. He apologizes for what he somehow did and says he won't have any more coffee, and says his daughter is sleeping better now. Then the already boring issue gets sidetracked by a subplot with Stern. A time researcher tells him that he's got a lead on the fugitive. He says someone came to him with a sob story to get hired as an assistant, but when he saw the news reports, he figured that he was actually the fugitive. He gets thanked for telling him there's no other way out of the room, and Stern and Rose use guns to threaten Xander, who shoots back. Xander naturally wants to go back in time to before the tide of the robot revolution of the Zero Series started rising. So he uses the time machine on himself. Brightman makes things in the lab brighter and apologizes for the pun as everyone has to shoot robots. Wily has some nonsensical dialogue that he thought it was too hazardous to build here, so he just bridged it. Which doesn't explain to me why he didn't have an entire floor instead of a bridge without a railing. Eventually, Megman sees a giant robot, which is eventually explained to be a weapon Wily built to get military sponsorship, only to get sanctioned for it. So that doesn't make any sense. So apparently the comic wants us to feel bad for Wily for getting banned from robotics because he built something to get military sponsorship, only for him to get arbitrarily punished for it while Dr. Light was allowed to build all of the Sniper Joes he wanted because they were smaller than what he made, but even more deadly because they could go anywhere they want. Well, this thing is probably not going to kill anyone. Or Wily's lying and built the Wily Walker to try to take over the world, which needs to be established because it's less depressing than what he's saying, but still. You'd think if he made this to try to get military sponsorship, he would have asked the military if they wanted him to build it for them before doing so, instead of being handed the idiot ball. He gets called out for putting chemical weapons on it, and he makes an excuse that he was trying to show up its versatility, which doesn't make sense because chemical weapons aren't allowed to be used by the military anyways, even though bullets are A-okay. So it has to be that he did make this for trying to take over the world, because he would have known he wouldn't be allowed to do that. Too bad Cossack doesn't have a thought bubble where he says that has to be the case. He says he's trying to remember to cover up, and gives Megman a supposed shutdown code that just activates it. It cuts back to the future. I wonder why the X stories aren't sectioned off to their own side story. Because this is no better than what the Star of the Knuckles comic did, but worse, because it got it right the first time. At the same mesa, a century later, someone gets told Kane wanted X to show up. Then X envies the Reploids because they're built with their purpose in mind. And also envies Zero because he doesn't remember what he was built for very conveniently, but is already an excellent hunter. Kane says his team that he has, all of a sudden, discovered a hidden chasm at this site, and detected metals that dated back to Dr. Light's lifetime. It turns out he found the remains of the Wily Walker, which hadn't been destroyed by a laser being fired into the chasm a long time ago for some reason. But the story ends there. I don't see the point of him discovering it. That's why it's a shame that ends here, because the X story just seems like a waste of comic space so far. This issue, after a whole bunch of unnecessary boredom we could have just cut past with the text box telling us what happened, had Dr. Light give a boring speech about how he wants to use Gamma to help people in natural disasters, just for Wily's robots to steal from him. And Wily makes people think they're working for Raw Moon because they weren't reprogrammed out of it to avoid getting in trouble. It doesn't work for an adaptation because it doesn't explain how he got out of this in the game. And it's annoying that the reason he turns on Dr. Light again is that the writer forced Dr. Light to take full credit for the creation of the first Robot Masters. Which could only be because crediting Wily wouldn't be a good look. But then if he has that logic, He wanted to let Wily be up on stage and make a speech with him. Why bother writing him to even consider not going through with the plan if he'll turn on what's clearly supposed to be a nice guy because he's only 99% nice? It just makes it unnecessarily more frustrating. And the story up to this point was just dull, uneventful talking, making it an especially boring issue. Nobody needed to see Wily's trial. It was exactly what you'd expect. It wasn't satisfying because it just had people get fooled into thinking he was brainwashed into causing the first 2 games. And it's annoying when a lie from a character is more interesting than what actually happens. This issue switches back and forth to being about either boring padding with no story, and Eggman leading an expedition to Wily's first lab, and eventually being given the activation code for the Wily Walker. You'd think that if its construction was why Wily was banned from robotics, then it would have been dismantled with its metal being scattered across the city to be used for building other things. But somehow nobody says that. Oh, it was too dangerous to disassemble. Bullshit. This is the future with sentient robots in it, and lasers. So little happened in the X part of the story that it seems pointless. It makes me wish padding was removed from the issue so it could have had room for the X story to build up something actually happening. Having a story with almost nothing but characters talking makes sense for a fanfiction. But when you're looking at a comic, you want stuff to happen so the visual medium can pay off.